Okay, so the Windows Azure Toolkit for Android, again, providing access to storage, to authentication services, if you will. A couple things I should note here. You wouldn't absolutely need this toolkit. In other words, everything in Windows Azure is available essentially through a RESTful API. So you could do the same work, writing essentially your own Java code to access these services, if you will, the hard way. And when I say the hard way, I mean a lot more work and a lot more maintenance as far as that code is concerned. As we'll see, the API is actually doing this for us underneath the covers. So what does the Windows Azure Toolkit for Android really provide us? Well, essentially a set of libraries that allows us really to code more in a native fashion. Not that you couldn't do RESTful work in Java, but essentially allow us to think more in terms of Java objects and object communication versus having to think about RESTful calls. Also much easier to write and maintain Android applications rather than having to maintain a mountain full of RESTful API code that we would create. Also helps to obfuscate those calls. I'm not saying that RESTful is a terrible API or one that's fraught with all sorts of difficulties, but as a Java developer, it probably isn't my first language of choice, or if you will, my first knowledge of choice. And so using Java APIs is usually going to make things a bit easier, and having that obfuscation obviously helps. And maybe more importantly than these capabilities as well, we are going to see even more features with, again, future products that Microsoft puts out as far as this toolkit. And so having to provide those all on your own and keep them up as opposed to waiting for Microsoft to put them out in some cases might actually be a little bit of a shortcut in your development time. Okay, so when I talk about the Windows Azure Toolkit and providing access to Windows Azure, again, what does that mean? Well, as I mentioned, first thing is we're talking about access to Windows Azure storage. Now, for those who are not aware, Windows Azure essentially provides for several different, if you will, data storage capabilities. Table storage, which is going to sound an awful lot like SQL database tables. In fact, it is structural, but not exactly the same as a SQL database out in the cloud. Providing kind of a structured table-like environment, but one that mimics a lot of the NoSQL types of data storage you see from other cloud vendors, in fact, from other third-party vendors as well. We also have queue storage, and queue storage allows for us to provide messaging in and out of the cloud, and allows our applications essentially to provide very loosely coupled communications. Azure provides the queue. You simply provide the messages in and out of that queue. And lastly, something called, not blog storage, sorry there folks, obviously my Microsoft presentation PowerPoint slide that did a little bit of a correction there. It should be called blob.blog storage. So blob storage allows us to store all sorts of images or anything you could put in bit and byte form essentially in the cloud and access that in a very easy fashion. What Windows Azure Toolkit does not provide is access, at least today, to SQL Azure, as I mentioned. Again, the iPhone and the Windows 7 mobile platforms do actually provide access to SQL Azure, but Android does not at this point. And for those, again, who don't have some familiarity with Windows Azure, SQL Azure is essentially SQL Server in the Microsoft cloud. So we've got these capabilities, these storage accesses that we can make of the cloud. We also have the ability to authenticate. In fact, applications that you write from an Android perspective that need to access one of these services also has to have that authentication in place before you can go and access any one of these storages. Makes sense. You don't want people just going in, grabbing your data and changing your data without some sort of authentication. These authentication mechanisms might be helpful for other particular types of application needs, both now and in the future as well. We have the ability to directly access the data, if you will, just providing the applications with account ID and key. We'll talk more about that in a second. Or provide for authentication and access to your storage via a proxy service, which is the Microsoft recommended approach. And we'll talk about the options here as well in just a second. So authentication, there are essentially three different ways that this Windows Azure Toolkit for Android provides our Android devices a means of authentication. First, again, as I mentioned, direct access. What does this mean? You've got to provide, again, the key and user essentially ID and key to your actual application. And again, Android, Microsoft really frowns on this approach, not a best practice, and we'll talk about why here in a second. We have something called membership service, as well as the Windows Azure Access Control Service, or ACS. These are the other options with regard to authentication. We'll talk about how those work. I'll give you a couple pictures and hopefully we'll simplify that in a bit as well. These last two options, again, the member service and the ACS service, these require what we call a proxy service to be in place. Now, nicely, this is not part of Windows Azure for Android, but nicely something that Microsoft has provided for all mobile devices. In fact, it can be used even outside of mobile device communication. It's something called the Cloud Ready Package for mobile devices. This is a mechanism that really simplifies those proxy service-based mechanisms for accessing Windows Azure storage from any mobile device. More on that coming up in just a second as well. Okay, so when we talk about direct access authentication, what do we mean by that? So you might have a table or a queue or some sort of storage out there in Windows Azure, and you want your mobile device to go ahead and access that storage. How do you do that? Well, we're going to see that this Windows Azure Toolkit for Android provides the API to access those, but again, have to have authentication first. The easiest way to authenticate is simply provide inside of your Android application code the account URL for your storage and the access key for your storage in Windows Azure. Essentially, think about this as your username and password on a kind of a storage platform level. That has to actually be provided to your application. Pretty easy to set up. In fact, we'll take a look at how to do that from an API perspective. But obviously, there are some security concerns. Now, if you will, your account secrets are out there in the application. And anytime somebody with a mobile device that has your application out there is somehow now persona non grata, and you want to be able to take them out of access to your storage, that's going to be a bit difficult. Essentially, we've got to somehow figure out a way to get that application off of their device, and you may not have an ability to do that. Or, I guess the other way you could do it is simply change your storage account and all the information and keys and such that are associated with your account. But that brings up maintenance concerns. Now, everybody else who's accessing your account has some difficulties. They can't get access very readily now that you change things. You essentially have to give them a new Android app. So while it is an approach, and for cases where you have complete control of those mobile devices and where you have a certain limited number of devices, this is a quick and easy way to get up and running to authenticate those devices to Windows Azure and be able to access some of the resources like the storages that we'll talk about. The Microsoft preferred approaches is, again, to use a proxy service. The first one is authentication through proxy service via what we call membership. Again, this is provided through something called the Cloud Ready Packages for devices that Microsoft gives us. In fact, we'll talk about how to download this and get it set up. It's actually quite easy. In fact, it might be easier than actually writing the Android application. The membership service, if you will, proxy service, is actually an ASP.NET web role. Again, for those who are not familiar with Windows Azure, web role is essentially a web application, an ASP.NET web application running inside Microsoft Cloud. So this web application provides means for users to come on, register themselves, get their password set up. As an administrator of this account and this application web role, you can obviously take people out of membership, decline them access to certain storage capabilities, things of that nature. So essentially a full application already built to provide complete membership access. Mobile devices are going to then have an account which they can then use, essentially a username and password, which they can use to get an authentication token back from Windows Azure and be able to then go access things like storage. So the idea here is, as some sort of user of the system, I first come to the membership service, a web application, through my browser, get myself a username and password. I can then use that in my mobile device to now access these storage capabilities. Now, cleverly, you'll find that some Android applications have actually also provided the means to set up your account and essentially register yourself as a user through the Android device. In other words, they actually provide membership applications with the actual Android device as well. In fact, the sample app that Microsoft provides actually does that for you. So you don't necessarily need to have users go to a browser on their desktop to get membership, but it would require you to set up more capabilities in that Android application. Now, as you can start to probably see, this is a a paradigm that certainly requires a little bit more work to set up. But applications, that is your Android application, now know nothing about the actual storage account, the Azure account. The only thing that the application would actually see, in other words, if we ripped apart the code, would actually be the membership URLs. And so therefore, we're pretty safe. And if things change from a management perspective, in other words, you need to kick somebody out of access to your storage, it's a matter of going into the membership application and removing them from access. Now, when you have a huge number of users, well, this gets to be a bit of an issue, trying to manage individual users one at a time and kick them out or grant them access to your application. That can be a bit tough. And so therefore, this membership management approach, while certainly much more secure and usually a favored approach, is something that for a large user base probably isn't going to work all that well. And so therefore, we have the last option, which is authentication via ACS, the access control system that has been built into the Microsoft cloud.